Hello, everyone. Uh, good night. Today we are going to have Professor Mark's lecture, and we are very happy to invite her to join our lesson. She is a very famous professor about the positive psychology. We are very happy to know her and listen to her lecture. Today, Professor Mark will going to introduce us the social interest in positive psychology. Um, let's welcome to Professor Mark.
Mark，您的那个耳机。
Professor Mark, your speaker didn't turn on yet.
Then we went out. Okay. Now you can hear me okay?
Yes, no problem.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So as I was saying, this is a great opportunity to integrate what you know already about positive psychology or what you're learning about positive psychology to Adlerian psychology, but even more important, to be able to apply that to the classroom. So that's my intent for an excitement for today's lecture. Did that get translated okay? Did that get translated okay?
Yes, my classmate, we can turn on the captain in the Google Classroom and check the translation function on the Chrome. Then you can see the translation immediately.
Okay. Let me try to find that. So it's on my screen, is that correct?
Everyone's screen, they can translate to their language.
Oh, okay. They will be able to, but I don't. Okay.
Yes.
So I don't need to ask then. Okay. Okay. This is new to me right now, so be a little bit patient as we progress through this. Okay. So let's go to the first slide. Let's go to the first slide, please. Next slide. Okay. Oops. That doesn't look too good. Okay. Okay, that's good. Okay. So the relationship between Adlerian psychology and positive psychology is basically this, is often Adlerian psychology is considered to be the first positive approach to understanding human nature. And this was a huge deviation at that time, and to a great extent it still is. When we look at the next couple of bullets about Adlerian psychology, we can see that it really does cover not only the lifespan, but virtually every aspect of how people, why people behave the way that they behave. For example, the first bullet says holistic. That means that we cannot be divided, and each individual is a unique individual and must be understood in all aspects. So this idea of Adlerian psychology being holistic encompasses virtually all aspects of our human functioning. For this to be true, we have to be able to understand each idea of each individual. The second bullet on this particular slide is essentially saying that we are all individuals and we must be understood from an individual perspective. So these two items, along with the next slide, please. Go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The socially oriented, which we'll be talking about a lot tonight with social interest, but it's also teleological, which means that the behavior is goal oriented. So positive psychology and Adlerian psychology are optimistic theories. And I think it's important to understand that positive psychology works primarily with the individual, and we create a proactive and meaning-making individuals. But it also means with these optimistic theories that we're not determined by heredity or environment. So often you hear either or, and once in a while you hear a combination of both. But what we really need to be able to understand is that from the holistic point of view, is that Adlerian psychology integrates positive psychology in a meaningful way that we can use in the classroom, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So go back one. Positive psychology focused on character, strengths, and behaviors that allows individuals to build a life of meaning and purpose and to move beyond surviving and move towards flourishing. So we'll see how positive psychology and what we're going to be talking about tonight, social interest, we'll go back to the slide a little bit later and see how that integrates. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So social interest, excuse me, I need a drink of water. Social interest is a very important concept in Adlerian psychology. Let's go to the next slide. I think I have a bullet on that. Yeah. So social interest is one of the key concepts of Adlerian psychology. And I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about what social interest can mean in a day-to-day process. So in societies, we often have to make rules and regulations in order for the society to function correctly. And I'll use the example of Taiwan when I was here in the 1970s. In the 1970s, Taiwan was very different than it is now. And one of the ways that I saw the difference between the time that I was here in 1970 and the time I came back about 35 years later was that social interest had really shifted from the individual to the society. And the best way to think about that was the way that people used safety helmets. In the early 70s, safety helmets were required, but the law wasn't enforced. And as a result of that, it was a very difficult process to have people do what was in the best interest to society. However, by the time I came back in 2006, the society, as an example, was very orderly. People were wearing helmets. They abided by the rules and regulations because there was more of an interest to belong to a larger whole than just the individual. So as a country develops, there's a sense of being in a developing status, more of a sense of self-interest as opposed to social interest. But as a society progresses, as Taiwan has, that social interest increases a great deal. So when we're thinking about social interest, we can think about it from the individual perspective, but also from the societal perspective as well. So this next bullet alludes to this. Adler's concept of social interest encompasses the feelings of belonging and working together, to be part of a larger whole that cooperates to work and produce for the good of everyone. So this sort of concept of everybody is in this together really translates nicely to the classroom. And one of the major learning aspects of incorporating social interest is to be able to do that in a larger context with a group. And the classroom is a really good example of this, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So I want to go over a couple phrases in this bullet that's up right now. So Adler's concept of social interest encompasses, and this is the important part, feelings of belonging and working together to be a part of a larger whole that cooperates to work and produce for the good of everyone. So what happens oftentimes, and we can really see this in the culture of the United States, Taiwan and the United States are very different in their attitudes towards each other. In the United States, it's much more individualistic, meaning that everybody kind of has to fight for what they get, and they have to compete at a very high level. But one of the things that I've also seen in Taiwan is, as generous as people are to each other, there is also this need to be the best. To the competition is really important. And oftentimes the competition then is at the expense of a larger concept, which is society. So in a classroom, I don't think there's anything wrong with competition if competition is incorporated into a larger concept, and that larger concept is social interest. So they aren't necessarily, you can't say get rid of competition and you'll have social interest at all. But is the good that you're becoming, can you use that good to the contribution of others? And I keep saying this in the classroom, whether it's a fourth grade classroom or a middle school classroom or even a high school classroom, being able to bring everybody to work for that larger whole and be able to cooperate and work together is a great experiment and a great example for students to be able to take towards their larger life. So Adler's concept encompasses these things. Let's go to the next slide and we'll get a better idea of what social interest is. Next slide, please.
Is this one?
I think it's this one, but Professor Mark is not here. I think because of the Wi-Fi.
Sometimes happen.
But Julia is still online.
I think most countries are used to use Ring, but in Taiwan we use Google.
Okay, I got disconnected again. I apologize for that, and I'm back now. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I got my mic unmuted. Good. Okay, let's go to the previous slide. I just want to make sure where I'm at. Yeah, okay. Go back to the next one. Yes, thank you. So hopefully we won't get kicked off again, but if we do, I'll know what to do. So let's continue on. Social interest can generally be defined as genuine concern for others. So let's talk about the genuine concern for others. In the United States society, we always greet each other, how are you doing? How are you doing? How's it going? But we're not really expecting an answer to that. So I'm not sure that that's genuine concern. But when we look at somebody in the eye and we ask that same question, how are you doing? Then I think we're approaching more the idea of what social interest is about. Is that genuine concern for others, not the social norm, not the social nuance of being kind and being pleasant and that sort of business, but beyond that, is there a genuine concern for others? So that's a pretty important first step towards understanding social interest, but also a cooperative approach towards life. So, how do we foster a cooperative approach toward life within ourselves, but also within the larger community? So, I think part of social interest is being that self-aware of how is this contributing? How am I cooperating with a larger aspect other than just myself? And then a third way of defining social interest is a striving for healthy community. So social interest is much more than a word or a concept. One of the problems with the term social interest, at least for English, is it just doesn't translate very well. In German, which was what Adler spoke, it tends to be much more, I think, fully understood from a societal point of view. From what I can tell, the concept of social interest is very closely related to many of the concepts or ideas within Taiwan society. So I think it does work very well towards that. But again, what I've seen within my observation of societies in general is the more it is competitive, the more it becomes self-interested as opposed to social interested. So again, I'm suggesting that it's not an either or, but that they both can work together. And I think that's the idea that we should be looking at. It's more than a word, feeling, or concept. It's an idea that everyone has value, everyone belongs, and everyone is equal. In my way of understanding social interest, if we understand these three things, everyone has value, everyone belongs, and everyone is equal. If that's the starting point that we can operate from, then social interest will be front and center at all times. So let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So some characteristics of social interest include the individuals who display social interest function according to values that move a person toward the socially useful side of life. So we're going to talk about values. I think when we meet again, the third time that I meet with you, I believe that we're going to be talking a little bit more about values. And I'm not going to say too much about them right now, except that values is kind of the underlying reason that we do what we do. If I hold the door for somebody so that they can go through safely, that's based most likely on a value, that I value that individual. I want to be helpful for that individual. That individual will value my usefulness. So the useful side of life is just that. It's things that enhance, that make better, not just for the individual, but for everybody concerned. So following rules and regulations, being respectful of other people's personal space, their time, and who they are. So when we function according to the values that are at the bedrock of who we are as individuals, I think then we most likely are moving towards the socially useful side of life. I'm not suggesting that there aren't values that are not good, but in general, when we think about the values that motivate us, that keep us doing what we should be doing, these are pretty positive. Their choices allow them to meet life's demands, and they refuse to observe themselves as victims. I think it's easy for most people who are in a competitive environment, when they aren't being as competitive as they would like to be, then they become victims, or they become complainers, or they blame others, or they give up. And these choices are exactly opposite of what we want to be able to foster within a classroom. All students do not operate from the same environment. They don't have the same nurturance at home, or they may not be able to learn at the same pace because of life circumstances that we may or may not understand. So as a result, when we have individuals that come from a wide spectrum, and the system that we're operating in is very competitive, that tends to leave people behind. And it's very easy for the people who get left behind then to see themselves as victims. In a way, they are victims, but it's not helpful to be able to see ourselves that way. When we see ourselves as not being victims, then it gives us opportunity to achieve and to overcome whatever difficulties that there are to overcome. The third bullet on this particular slide is that they progress through life in a way that is useful to self and others, and they accept responsibility for self and others. So they kind of have a good sense of who they are within the spectrum of individuals. They know where they start and other people begin. They know how to respect, and they know how to be able to move forward. So these are some characteristics of social interest. Let's go to the next slide, please. Social interest requires the development of both cooperation and contribution. So these are two words that are very commonly used when we're talking about the degree or nature of social interest. So we can kind of measure it in terms of how cooperative individuals are and how they contribute to the larger whole. So it does require the development of both of these. And so often we see cooperation and contribution are not as important to individuals as competing. So cooperation and contribution tend to downplay competition, not necessarily negate it, but certainly put it in a perspective that it does not push out the ability to cooperate or to contribute. And social interest is an expression of our capacity for give and take. Sometimes we call this flexibility. When a problem arises, if a person shows a high degree of social interest, then they will be in problem solving mode. They'll try to find answers to the problem. They will work cooperatively in whatever the problem is. I know in society, when there are great difficulties in society, people tend to work together. They tend to be very aware of their interest in each other. And I imagine if we had a way of being able to measure social interest from a societal point of view, that in great times of difficulty, the first response is towards social interest. So it's that expression of our capacity forgive, and to take, to be able to accept, but also be able to move forward and move on and move beyond. Let's go to the next slide, please. So at this point, I'd like to pause and see what people are thinking about the concept of social interest. So I don't know how many people are here today, but I imagine that there's several. And I would like a contribution from at least two different people. So as you're hearing about what social interest is, what are some things that come to your mind? What does social interest remind you of? Or what does social interest make you think about in terms of who you are in society? So would anybody like to contribute? I need two people to share. Go ahead, please.
For me, social interest is for me, social interest is when you are living in society and when you expect something from society. So you also tend to give something to live in that society. But one thing that came in my mind when
Yeah.
I was listening to your lecture is that nowadays, because of globalization, people are moving to different countries. Like for example, I am not Taiwanese, but I'm in Taiwan. So does that decrease the level of social interest in people? Like for example, I will not have much social interest as I would have with my own country, uh, in comparison to people in comparison to Taiwan. Like I will have less social interest with Taiwan than my own country.
So why do you think that is?
Because I am living in Taiwan for like very short term, and I don't expect much from this place. My expectation is much more higher from my own place, so I will tend to engage in social interest more when I am back to my country. But
Yeah.
I will be engaged less with this social interest
Okay.
in foreign
So
country.
good. I think this is an important concept. So if we're only thinking in terms of transaction, so what I get back, or what I give, others will give to me. If that's kind of an expectation, that's moving away from social interest and more towards self-interest. In other words, if I do this, this will happen. Social interest tends to be more a giving without expectation. I do it because it's not because I'm required to do it or I'm supposed to do it, but it's because it will be a contribution to a larger group. So that sense of belonging that we talked about a little bit earlier, and you're going to hear me talk about belonging probably almost every time you see me. Belonging is a key concept. And I think for you who contributed to the discussion about living in Taiwan, but Taiwan is not your culture, I think that sense of belongingness probably contributes to that idea. And when do we feel that we belong? I think I think when we embrace belonging, whether it be in a family, whether it be in a relationship, whether it be in a society, when we can embrace that belonging, then I think we're much more fully open to give who we are, but also to receive from the larger group. Um, you know, I see social interest a lot in two things that were very meaningful to me in my life. And one was team sports. I played baseball from the time that I was very little until I still want to play baseball. So the so that sense of belonging with a team and contribution, and when we're not contributing all that we can, we feel that we're letting others down. That camaraderie is the word that I oftentimes use to describe how it feels to be part of a team. But I was also part of the U.S. Navy for 21 years. And in that kind of an environment in the Navy, teamwork was everything. There was nothing that could be accomplished without enormous teamwork. And so there was the teamwork that came from, if I don't do it, I'm going to get in trouble. But you want to transfer that from that to, I want to contribute because it's important to me and I feel a sense of belonging. So when we're thinking about how to foster or to increase social interest, I think we should always start with the idea of belonging, which we'll talk about a little bit more today. But also, like I said, almost every time you see me, we'll probably be talking about that sense of belonging. So thank you for your contribution. I appreciate it, and I hope that made some sense to you, my response. I'd like one other student to contribute, please. Please, go ahead.
Is it Jia Rong first? Hi, Professor Ma. I'm Feng Yi. Yeah,
Okay.
because when you talk about the social interest, then comes into my mind is a group of volunteers like Zuchi, because I'm one of the Zuchi volunteers as well, and I work in this organization more than, I think, 10 to 15 years. So because when you bring out the terms of sense of belonging, I think I find of the sense of belonging to this organization. That's why I stay with this organization as a volunteer at the same time as a staff. So I can do kind of, when I doing the works, I find out the meaning of what I do. Yes, as compared as a volunteer or a staff, I can know that what I do is a good. I can do some contribution to the society and to the children as well. Yeah.
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 And I think volunteer organizations absolutely bring out the concept of social interest, both in how volunteer organizations give and how what their mission and intent is. However, we have to incorporate those ideas so that camaraderie that I talked about in team sports or in the military, that camaraderie, that caring more for the person next to you than you do for yourself. If we can translate that into beyond the team, into the family, or into the classroom, or into our larger society, how do we interact with the general public? Do we have a way that we present ourselves, that we want to present ourselves as being very giving and very caring, but at the same time, do we get angry easy? Do we become judgmental easily? So the concept of social interest is really, really difficult to comprehend entirely, because we're going to see another quote in just a couple minutes that helps us to see the complexity of it even more. So let's go to, oh, no, it's right here. I'm sorry. Okay, it's right here. So when Adler tried to describe what social interest looks like, he used the words of an unknown British author who said it means to see with the eyes of another, to hear with the ears of another, and to feel with the heart of another. So this idea of being able to go beyond just who we are and in our own person and be able to see with the eyes, to hear with the ears, and to feel with the heart of another. That's a very tall order, but I think it's very doable. I think we're not used to that. I think we're not used to, we have a tendency of being, at least I guess I should speak only to myself, but I think there's a tendency of when we meet somebody, we make judgments. And there's an automatic response that we have to life that is either pro-social or it's pro-individual. And I think to know the difference when we're being selfish and when we're being very giving and socially oriented, to be able to know that, this is a really good test. So if we get angry with another person, we're probably not seeing through their eyes or hearing through their ears or feeling with their heart. I'm not saying that we should be a perfect individual at all times, but I am saying that this concept of social interest, if we start incorporating that into who we are as human beings, won't our families be stronger? Won't our classrooms be more efficient and effective? And won't our society be able to handle the big problems that societies need to handle? So this is a way of thinking and a way of being that I think is pro-social, and it gives opportunity for us to be all that we can be. I don't think I'm going to say it today in this particular lecture, but we'll come back to social interest on a couple different occasions. And one of the measures of mental health is also a measure of social interest. So the more social interest we have, the more mental health we have. And we'll talk more about that specifically and maybe the rationale for that in a different time. Let's go to the next slide, please. So the significance of social interest. As I just said, social interest is a major key to healthy human functioning, including mental health, which is the very next one. According to Adler, social interest is a criteria or a critical factor for mental health. So according to Adler, social interest is a critical factor for mental health. So there's a relationship that's probably pretty easy to see that it's a cause and effect sort of relationship. And then social interest eases sense of isolation and loneliness. There's a lot of data that has probably started about 15 or 20 years ago. Let's just make it simple. Let's say it started at the beginning of this century, about 2000, of a great interest in understanding disease of desperation. It has many names, but that's one of them. And meaning that there are many people who suffer incredibly because of depression, because of addiction, because of a sense of loss and trauma that's occurred in part because of globalization. But there's a lot of other reasons that it exists. Society and culture can help to ease some of this, but social interest, that in my way of looking at it, is one of the ways in which we can ease the sense of isolation and loneliness. I'll talk more about this a little bit later in the course, but one of the important ways of overcoming addiction is through social interest. And you've probably heard of Alcoholics Anonymous and organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous. When we look at these organizations, what they really are is a great case study on what social interest can look like. Anybody, I often have taught addiction courses at different universities, and I'd always require my students to attend 5 open AA meetings. So during the 15-week semester, they had to attend 5 different meetings. And at first, they were very defended and they felt very awkward and they felt like they were intruding and this and that. But by the 3rd or 4th meeting, they were feeling a sense of belonging. And then they could really understand what the function of a group like AA is all about. In a way, it's basically bringing the person from the self-interest of addiction to the larger concept of social interest to society. And in doing so, easing the need for addiction. So I'll talk about addiction a little bit more because that's the area that I've studied the most and I've lectured the most in as a way of illustrating. And I know that addiction means different things to different people, but I'll try to be a little bit more succinct in what it means to how I'm using it a little bit later in the semester. So again, that last bullet, social interest eases a sense of isolation and loneliness. And I suspect that social interest also works heavily with these diseases of despair, whether it be depression, whether it be addiction, whether it be the isolation that happens from loss of family or trauma. That social interest is an anecdote. It's one of the ways in which we can solve some of the problems related to globalization and other issues. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we've alluded to this already, and so I'm not going to spend too much time, but destructive behaviors, including substance abuse and addiction, are theorized to stem from a lack of social interest. So I just suggested that maybe social interest is an anecdote to these. Well, this particular bullet is suggesting that lack of social interest is a cause. And again, I hope that you are thinking about how this can apply in your lives. And I will be using the example of the classroom because I'm thinking that many of you have experience in the classroom or currently in the classroom or want to be in the classroom teaching. And I want you to be thinking about everything that we've said tonight so far about social interest and how you can apply that in the classroom or in your family or in the groups that you belong to or society that you belong to. Let's go back to that previous slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so deficits in social interest, this is the second bullet. Deficits in social interest diminish ability to experience a sense of belonging and empathy towards others. Okay, so deficits in social interest diminishes the ability to experience a sense of belonging and empathy towards others. And I think most would probably agree that if we have a sense of belonging and if we can be empathic towards others, then our life, but also the life of those that we're working with and impacting, whether it be our children, whether it be our siblings, people that are in our family, or whether it be the individuals that we are working with in our professional capacities, such as teachers. If we can be able to foster these things, I think that the intent or the objective, think about the classroom. And if we had a classroom that had very high social interest, that you as the teacher were constantly encouraging uh, uh, a classroom that demonstrates social interest. Can you imagine the learning that would take place and how different that learning would be? And we're going to talk about that at the very end of tonight's lecture, is imagining how this could be and imagining what would the result be. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. When I read this a few hours ago, I wanted to change some things with it, but we're going to use this as an example, and then I'll tell you how I think I would have liked to have changed this. So this is just an example. I used to work in a high school. This is quite some time ago now. I worked in a high school in which I worked with students that were at high risk of having difficulties, such as dropping out of school or poor academic performance or anger behavior issues, whatever it might be. So these are the students that I worked with every single day for, I probably saw on average 6 or 7 different students every single day. So I got very familiar with children that were in the foster care system. And Marvin is kind of a case study. It's not an exact case study of anybody that I worked with, but it's kind of a composite of several different students that I worked with. So Marvin was without very much family from age 10 on, and he trusted no one. At age 14, he was diverted into a foster parent environment that was rich with love, encouragement, and demonstration of social interest on a daily basis. When Marvin was 18, he was ready to cooperate and contribute. We can easily imagine what happens to most people like Marvin. And so, what happened to Marvin, he went from a very angry person. And when I first met him, I knew him for 2 years. I knew him at age 15 and age 16. And so, not too long after he was diverted into the foster parent environment. And the one thing that I did that I worked with him about, and students that are like him, is that they have a sense that life is terribly unfair. And so, therefore, they have their guard up at all times. And not too many people enjoy being around people like that. And so, when Marvin saw a different way of being, when that environment of love and encouragement was demonstrated on a daily basis and social interest was practiced within that family, it turned a very angry person who would probably end up not contributing very much to society. So most people like Marvin, that's exactly what happens, is they shut down and then they defend themselves. And when they do that, there's not much of a way for them to feel good about themselves or their contribution or how they belong or don't belong. It's usually they feel that they don't belong. So this is an example of what we can do in our environment. If we really embrace what social interest is and practice social interest, that example just in of itself will change people's lives. And when you can expand that to the capacity, your professional capacity, and really be able to incorporate that, it's pretty amazing. We're going to see this, some ways that we can do this on the next slide. Next slide, please.